Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to talk today about the evolution of Surah 2, a topic I've looked at from various angles in the past. I will start by laying out my 2017 position on the evolution of the Surah, then the rationale behind my current hypothesis. In Why Problematize Surah 2, I will attempt to explain why I think we need why we need a hypothesis for its evolution. By way of late antique context, I will then look at the composition of speeches in Roman oratory and at what we know about the mechanics of late antique text production. Back in 2017, I argued that Surah 2 was formed after pre-existing textual blocks were pieced together, expanded and modified in import via the use of insertions, while maintaining their basic textual integrity. I based my understanding of the structure of the Surah on Mehdi Bazargan's division of it into textual blocks, divided thematically, then arranged in accordance with their mean verse length. I suggested that within these textual blocks, two pre-circulating sermons might have been joined together to form what is now Part 2, Bazargan's Block 164, verses 40 to 152. I was quite vague back in 2017 about how I imagined the evolution of the rest of the Surah. I refer to a third sermon, opening with the address to the people in verse 168, largely coinciding with Bazargan's Block 183, and a fourth sermon, opening with a recommendation to consider, in verse 243, the opening of Bazargan's Block 192. I present the introduction and conclusion as having been bracketed around the growing Surah at a relatively late stage. A few months later, Nicolai Sinai added my hypothesis into his own working understanding of how Surah 2 evolved, the outcome of several phases of literary growth. Nicolai agreed with me that Part 2, verses 40 to 123, the address to the Israelites, could be an entirely credible surah just by itself. He proposed that this surah then accrued parts 1, verses 1 to 39, and 3, verses 124 to 152, before the rest of the surah was added. We were largely agreed at that point on verses 40 to 123 being the kernel of what evolved into Surah 2, and on that kernel being expanded by verses 124 to 152 as part of the first phase of the surah's expansion. When I sat down to break verses 40 to 123 into structurally defined paragraphs as part of my work for the QSIP project, what I found was a neat series of paragraphs bound by lexical repetition and indications of closure. Verses 40 to 48 are bound by an inclusio, for example. Verses 49 to 57 have a threefold repetition of la'allakum, framing that particular section, and so on. The same pattern continues throughout this section of the surah, with the closer to verses 83 to 86 echoing the closer of verses 58 to 62, and verses 87 to 103 bound by the threefold repetition of min indallahi at verses 89, 101, and 103. Verses 111 to 118, however, stood out for me. They are categorized by the introduction of a new theme, criticism of both Jews and Christians. This is a theme that continues in verses 124 onwards, with explicit references to both Jews and Christians in verses 135 and 140. The theme of faces, too, is new in verses 112 and 115, and recurs in verses 144, 149, and 150. The closer of this particular verse group, however, is an almost verbatim repetition of the closer to verse 107, and there are other echoes of prominent phrases from the same verse. Despite that this verse group looks thematically forwards, it looks structurally back. This reminded me of George Guthrie's hooked key words, expertly used by Neil Robinson in his 2001 discussion of the structure of Surah 5. Guthrie describes a phenomenon whereby neighbouring text units are bound together by the introduction of what will be key words in the second unit in the conclusion of the first unit. The introduction of the themes of the Jews and the Christians, and the references to faces towards the end of verses 40 to 123, would therefore serve as a bridging hook connecting verses 40 to 123 to verses 124 to 152. The same phenomenon was described as an inverted hinge by Henry van Dyck Paranak, whose research influenced that of Matt Sarnisser in his year 2000 division of Surah 2. In an inverted hinge, the end of Sermon A is interrupted by a precursor of Sermon B, producing an A-B-A-B transition. Sarnisser does not place an inverted hinge around the transition at verse 124 of Surah 2, although he does locate one in verses 153 to 162. The repetition of phrases from verse 107 in verses 116, 117 and 120, meanwhile, reminded me of Carl Friedrich Paulmann, who applies Hebrew Bible logic for the identification of insertions to the Quran in a 2012 publication. Paulmann's hypothesis was investigated by Nicolai in his article for my 2021 Structural Dividers volume. The example provided by Paulmann is verses 159 to 161 of Al-Baqarah, with Insanus' so-called inverted hinge. Paulmann argues that the expansion of the verse final God rejects them and so do others of verse 159 into the verse final God rejects them as do the angels and all people of verse 161 suggests that verses 160 and 161 are an insertion. If we look at the repetitions in verses 111 to 120, we see a similar pattern. Control of the heavens and earth belongs to him, recurs first as everything that is in the heavens and the earth belongs to him, and then as he is the originator of the heavens and the earth. You have no protector or helper but God is repeated almost verbatim, as you would have no protector or helper other than God. When coupled together with the sudden introduction of the Christians into the criticism of the Jews, we do seem to have indicators of a possible insertion here. And this section of Surah 2 doesn't just echo language from the immediately preceding verses. The material highlighted just in red in your PowerPoint slide is repeated from verse 107, immediately prior to the suspected insertion. But that material, along with material in black font, is also familiar from mid to late Meccan surahs. I have argued previously that the Quran may have blended the unfamiliar with the familiar in order to make new material immediately palatable to its audience, a blend of greatest hits with new songs. The high density of familiar formulae from mid to late Meccan surahs in verses 111 to 121, therefore, adds to the evidence that this might be a later addition to a pre-existing text. What I would propose then would be that we speculatively remove verses 111 to 121 from an original sermon that ran from verses 40 to 123, leaving us with the sermon I've placed up on your PowerPoint slide, which I have dubbed Sermon A. This has a significantly shorter address to the believers before the reprise of the inclusio. You compare the short address to the people at the close of Surah 49 and the Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu tale at the close of Surah 57, among other surahs that I break into paragraphs from my article for Nicolai's Medina and Quran volume. The introduction of the new material from verses 111 to 121, highlighted in red on your PowerPoint slide, would then coincide with the expansion of Sermon A with the Qibla material, also highlighted in red. What Guthrie would identify as hooked keywords, and what Parunak would describe as an inverted hinge, would therefore be an editorial rather than an oral compositional feature. If Vida Alfnama were also adduced to put the Solomon verse 102, to one side, on the grounds that this is an extremely long verse, thematically self-contained, whose internal rhythm is much looser than that of the surrounding verses, and whose penultimate clause is an almost verbatim repetition of the opening clause of verse 90, we then end up with an original published sermon of 71 verses, to 8,314 transcription letters, Sermon A, about the same size as Surahs 8, 20, or 33, with a similar mean verse length to Surah 33. The addition of a further 40 verses, or 5,062 transcription letters, in itself about the size of Surahs 35, 41, or 42, creates the republished sermon ABAB, 13,381 transcription letters, about the size of Surahs 9, 11, or 16, with a mean verse length that is comparable to that of Surahs 13 or 59. Such a hypothesis shrinks the building blocks that make up Surah 2 down to a more manageable size, as did my 2017 hypothesis, but it also explains the addition of verses 124 to 152 in a way that neatly utilizes contrasting theories current in biblical research to posit a diachronic explanation to immediately recognizable structural Quranic feature. Which begs the question, of course, whether this is all too neat. Is it unsurprising that Nicolai and I, basing our logic for the most part on the same secondary sources, would come up with similar schemes for how Surah 2 evolved? Are we in fact artificially creating, along with Matt Sarnesser, Anil Robinson, and Carl Friedrich Paulmann, an entirely 20th and 21st century problem in Surah 2, which we are then artificially setting ourselves the task of solving? Why problematize Surah 2 at all? Why posit evolutionary models to explain its existence at all? For one reason and one reason alone: it is very, very long. At 47,966 transcription letters, it can easily take the average reciter 2 hours or more to get through it. The next surah down in length is almost half its size. It takes an average reciter 1 hour to 1 hour 20 to get through Surah 4. If we compare this to Cicero's speeches, also delivered from memory, most of which lasted 20 minutes to an hour, we get a sense of the sheer scale of Surah 2. The recitatio, by which Roman authors from around the 30s BCE to about 170 CE first aired their work by reading it aloud in a semi-private setting, could go on for several days, with estimates varying between 1 and 3 hours for an average day's session. But here we are talking about the stamina of an audience to sit still and be read to from a written copy of a work, not the ability of a speaker to speak, either from a memorized text or extempore. Surah 2 is certainly emblematic in the Hadith record on account of its size. The surah is used as a place marker for extreme length. During the eclipse, the Prophet stands for as long as it would take to recite Surah 2. During prayer with Auf ibn Malik, the Prophet pauses in prostration for as long as it would take to recite Surah 2. When Mu'adh ibn Jabal leads the people in either Surah 2 or Surah 4 in the evening prayer, the Prophet rebukes him, suggests that he recites shorter surahs instead. The narrative doesn't specify between Surah 2, the longest surah of the Quran, or Surah 4, the second longest, precisely because the content of the surah doesn't matter here, only the length. Even if we are skeptical about the provenance of the Hadith and believe that what the Hadith record reflects is the attitude of Muslims to their scripture 100 or 200 years after the revelation, we see that 100 or 200 years after the revelation, the longest surahs of the Quran were remarkable precisely for their extreme length. When it comes to its composition, what the Hadith record reflects is a Surah 2 that was revealed and published in pieces. There are separate Hadith of the revelation of verses 285 to 286, 275 to 276, 144, 184, and 185. These are not described as having been immediately slotted into the surah and recited as part of an existing fabric, but they are published orally as standalone statements. Other Hadith describe the revelation being written down in pieces, with intriguingly little detail of how intervening revelations might have been placed in existing surahs. Specific surahs are described as storehouses for individual verses, but the almost random placement of verses described in the Hadith record does not reflect the thematic progression and the network of structural repetitions that I observed in verses 40 to 82 and in verses 86 to 123. So I would say that there is a mismatch between what we know about the initial recording or publication of Quranic revelations and what we can witness about the structure of the long Quranic surahs. I don't think that Nicolai and I are responding to a problem that was created by modernity. The evolution of the long Quranic surahs is a legitimate research question. There are pieces of the jigsaw missing. There are similarities between the vision of the recording of the Quran as reflected in the Hadith record and what we are told about the recording of Umayyad poetry. Abu Ubaidah, writing in the early 9th century, relates how the poet Jarir orders his transmitter to prepare tablets and inks in preparation for an act of composition, just as the Prophet summoned Zayd along with the tablet or the scapula and an inkpot. Al-Marzubani, writing a century later than Abu Ubaidah, also describes Dur Rumma as having transmitters who took dictation from him and would read his poems back to him so that he could correct the text they had recorded. The Hadith record similarly reports that the Prophet would dictate the revelation to his scribe, who would then read it back to him for correction. If one is skeptical about the provenance of Hadith, it is perhaps unsurprising to see so many overlaps between how the Hadith imagines the composition of the Quran to have taken place and how 9th and 10th century literary critics and collectors imagined the composition of Umayyad poetry to have taken place. But I nonetheless find it encouraging that A, we have consensus on the immediate production of written records in both traditions, and B, the Hadith record apparently imagines the mechanics of recording the Quran as not entirely dissimilar to the mechanics of recording poetry. It is worth casting our net slightly wider to compare this vision with what we know of the composition of speeches in late antiquity. The Quran presents itself as a text that is revealed to and memorized by the Prophet in advance of delivery. The Hadith contain copious references to the revelation being written down. Gregor Schurler describes 8th century poets as reciting from memory, but at least in some cases, writing or dictating the verses they produced in the process of composition. Secondary sources agreed that Greco-Roman orations, too, were delivered from memory. Orators were required to commit their orations to memory. The fourth of the 5 stages of classical rhetoric is described as memorization, and the sermons of the Church Fathers are argued to have been first written down and only then memorized. For the Romans, oral delivery from memory was considered superior to dictation from a written source. Eyes and hands are described as the 2 chief aids to delivery. They should not be occupied with negotiating a written text. Orations were carefully crafted and delivered. The wrong use of stylistic effects, the misuse of bodily gestures, the inappropriate tone of voice to declaim a specific part of a speech, the disorderly internal organization of the arguments, or the failure to memorize the speech could all result in an unsuccessful speech. While Synesius of Cyrene, writing in the 5th century, describes how a sophist might endure many nights without sleep, be on the strain many days, come near to distilling away his soul by hunger and anxieties, in order to compile something good. I knew this would strike a chord. Yeah. We have references to Roman works being composed in stages. Marcus Cornelius Fronto, writing in the 2nd century, describes how copies were first written out by hand, then corrected, before multiple copies were made of the final, polished version. Note that the correction stage in the production of a manuscript is also attested in the Hadith record. Works of philosophy, epistolary, and poetry were also composed in stages. Philodemus dictates first the passages he wishes to include, then the links and introductions, then he corrects the first draft, then the final text is copied out or dictated. Pliny the Younger dictates several versions of the same text while working on an opus. Horace dictates from what is already a carefully meditated text. Copies for memorization were usually written on wax tablets, and wax was the first medium upon which texts were transcribed. The 1st century Quintilian, who died around 100 CE, recommends wax, as it is easier to correct on wax than it is on parchment. Catullus refers to his wax-covered tablets, while Horace describes the process of writing poetry as involving lots of rubbing out, multa litura. Which leads us into the mechanics of pre-modern text production. Michelle Brown, writing in the British Library Journal, describes how wax tablets known from early antiquity actually remained widespread until the 16th century and continued to be used as late as the 19th. They assumed a number of forms, occurring singly as diptychs or as polyptychs, bound into a codex. They were a cheap, reusable alternative to other writing surfaces. Here we have an example of a very ancient Neo-Assyrian diptych, 2 writing tablets hinged together as a folding set. This 3rd century example comes from ancient Greece. And here we have a joined pair of wax writing tablets from Coptic Egypt, dated between the 6th and the 8th centuries. We do not have examples from Arabia, but Jacques Ricmans, writing in 1993, refers to the discovery of ivory styles in Yemen and concludes that their presence seems to point to the possible joint use of wax-covered tablets. Whoops, sorry, skipped. Now I'm completely lost there. We certainly have plenty of witnesses to Roman literary works being composed on wax tablets. On this slide, we have references to the wax tablets of Pliny the Elder, Horace, and Callimachus, but works were rarely stored on wax tablets. You will recall from this slide, which I showed you earlier, that Roman works were composed in stages. The 1st and 2nd stages are reflected in the Hadith record, and I would argue could plausibly have taken place on wax tablets or another easily erasable surface. The multiple copies that are made of the final polished version in Fronto's account, however, refer to a different stage in the compositional process. Post-Quranic sources certainly do not reflect any wax tablets. What the Hadith record and other early sources reflect is a Quran that is written on parchment, on palm stalks, on splinters of limestone, on scapular bones, on pages of parchment or papyrus, in collections or booklets of such pages. While a lot of this might come across as fairy tales to the modern reader, if we look at each of these writing materials in turn, we see that we have copious examples of oracle bone inscriptions from ancient China. We also have examples of Quran on scapula. This one from Andalusia, dated to no earlier than the mid-10th century, contains the throne verse repeated 4 times over. the authors of a recent article suggest that it was probably intended for talismanic use. This undated camel scapular containing Surah al-Fatiha was probably also for talismanic use. We have no early Quran written on palm leaf stalks, but Rickmans attests the presence of palm leaf stalks in addition to wooden tablets, wooden sticks, in ancient South Arabia. These now normally measure from a few centimetres to 30 centimetres in length, 3 centimetres in diameter. The left-hand margin of some of the ancient South Arabian sticks and stalks is pierced through with a large hole. Multiple sticks or stalks could therefore have been bound together. In addition to the Hadith record, the act of writing on palm sticks is attested in pre-Islamic poetry and associated by both Labid and Imr al-Qais with Yemen. This is what the stalks look like. The high status of both parchment or papyrus as a suitable vehicle for scripture, meanwhile, is made clear in the Quran in 80, 11-16, in 52-3, in 691, and in 6-7, which alludes to the fact that the Quran is not, in fact, sent down on papyri that have already been transcribed in heaven. The pre-Islamic record alludes to dotted pages, to the books of monks, and to Syrian papyrus. Some of this vocabulary is familiar to us from the Surah and the Hadith record. Our early parchment Qurans, here we have the example of the Sinai palimpsest, tend to be from large, heavy Qurans, probably intended for display in a mosque. Like the wax tablets, parchment does have the benefit of being reusable. The hair side, which is less permeable, can be cleaned simply by washing with a sponge, but the flesh side, especially in cases where the ink contains a metallic compound, will sometimes need to be scraped in order to remove any writing. There is evidence that this took place on some folios of the Sinai palimpsest. On papyrus, we have a number of early Quran amulets. These often contain Surah 1, like we saw in the scapular amulet, or Surahs 112, 113, and 114, as we have here, in addition to Surah 1. Like the throne verse amulet on the Andalusian goat scapula, the Quranic material on this papyrus amulet is written out multiple times. We do also have entire surahs on papyrus, however, that do not seem to be intended for talismanic use. Here we have almost the entirety of Surah 2, dated to the late 7th or early 8th century and assumed by Mathieu Tillier and Naïm Vontiem to be a copy from somebody's private library. Here we have a papyrus sheet with the entire text of Surah 69 on the recto and the entire text of Surah 64 on the verso, dated to the late 8th, early 9th century. Nick Posgay posits that this formed part of a private anthology and states that increasingly it seems that certain individuals had longer manuscripts that could have been read for private study and prayer. Posgay points out that both this papyrus and another containing the second half of Surah 76 and the first half of Surah 36 contain surahs that are not traditionally consecutive, indicating that they were never part of complete Qurans. While most of our extant papyri were found in very arid environments, Egypt, Petra, Judea, Samaria, and the Middle Euphrates, a large number of papyrus scrolls were carbonized and thereby preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. And we have textual attestations to the use of papyrus across the Greco-Roman world. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century CE and based in what is now Algeria, apologized to a correspondent for sending a letter written on a scrap of parchment rather than on papyrus or on an ivory tablet. Cassiodorus, writing in the 6th century in Scylletium in Italy, praises papyrus as superior to rough tablets as a vehicle for learned tracts. With the exception of the splinters of limestone, lichaf, therefore, the Hadith record largely reflects the material evidence. We have Quran talismans written on bones, we have manuscripts of entire surahs on papyrus, plausibly for private use, and we have early codices on parchment, plausibly for public use. Which leaves me with at least 5 minutes, actually, and one remaining question. If we accept that wax tablets or something similarly rewritable might have supported the initial transcribing of isolated verses and verse groups, and that parchment or papyrus might have supported the production of Qurans, or of partial Qurans intended for public or personal use, how do we envisage the formation of surahs themselves? How might we imagine the insertion of new material into a pre-existing sermon, as I posit occurred in the formation of Surah 2? Juan Cole, in a recent book chapter, proposes the transcription of Medina insertions into the margins of papyrus choirs. But what I am proposing involves the manipulation of much larger blocks of text. For an answer to my particular question, it is worth turning to what we know about the compilation of encyclopedic texts. Monica Amsler, in her recent volume Reimagining the Talmud in the Light of Late Antique Book Culture, proposes that the building blocks that later made up the Talmud were first written out onto tablets, ostraca, rotuli, long narrow strips of parchment or papyrus, or papyrus scraps. Amsler adduces the example of Aulus Gellius in the late 2nd century, who talks about having a random collection of notes which he used to jot down, without any definite plan or order, ready to be compiled into work of literature, in this case his Attic Nights. While the Attic Nights and the Talmud are both very different texts to the Quran, this description of the unstructured recording of unrelated scraps of information is similar to what the Hadith record tells us about the initial transcription of the Quran. We can triangulate further back into late antiquity. Amsler adduces the 1985 research of Albert Locher and Rolf Rotländer, who hypothesized that Pliny, a century earlier than Aulus Gellius, collected passages on thin, small wooden slats. Every excerpt was written on an individual slat, which allowed moving them around until a rhetorically appealing structure was achieved. The discovery of over 1,800 thin wooden writing slats preserved in the waterlogged conditions of the Roman military camp of Indolanda in the north of England corroborated this hypothesis. As Amsler points out, we have an example of a thin wooden writing slat from 2nd century Judea, found with the Bar Kokhba manuscripts in the 1960s. But we also have, as Alan Hope documents, the discovery of 5th century writing boards from the Kelis oasis in Egypt. The image shows an agricultural account book, but these texts could also contain religious material. One surviving example has 5 Manichaean psalms still visible inscribed on its surface. Amsler argues that excerpts copied onto lightweight and thin material were much easier to handle than bulky wax tablets, and that slats allowed authors to experiment with different arrangements until they found the most suitable structure. If we look at this Moroccan Quran, written not on palm leaf stalks but on palm leaf fronds and on display at the Quran Museum in Sharjah, we can imagine how a text compiled of adjoining fragments might have worked. This is a relatively modern text, but ancient palm leaf manuscripts are an attested phenomenon in South Asia. We have extant manuscript fragments from the 2nd century CE. This Quran manuscript covers the whole text of the Quran in 70 pages. Each page contains 8 fronds, and each palm frond holds 3 lines of text, making a total of 48 lines of text per page. Seeing as almost every writing surface in late antiquity, with the exception of ostraca and animal bones, seems to have been pierced with holes to facilitate the formation of concertina, booklets and quires, almost every writing surface in late antiquity, with the exception of papyrus, was to some degree washable and reusable. A sermon could therefore be expanded into a surah without too much disruption to its pre-existing building blocks, and without too much difficulty. Again, this would provide a diachronic explanation for an existing Quranic structural feature. The model I propose for the expansion of Sermon A into Sermon AB is theoretically possible. To sum up then, what I have proposed is that we read the structural indications in verses 40 to 123 of Surah 2 to suggest that verses 111 to 121 were added to a pre-existing sermon, Sermon A. When the next part of the surah, verses 124 to 152, Sermon B, was adjoined to the growing surah. In Why Problematize Surah 2, I argue that the disproportionate length of Surah 2 begs the question of how the long surahs coalesced, as does the disparity between the description of the surah's evolution in the Hadith record and the literary structures we can perceive in the text itself. In the composition of speeches in late antiquity, I looked at how Roman oratory, also famously delivered without written prompts, was first recorded on wax tablets before being memorized and transferred onto papyrus or parchment. In the mechanics of pre-modern text production, I looked at material evidence for the various writing materials described in the Hadith. I attempted to triangulate between later sources, the Hadith record, and what we are told about the recording of Umayyad poetry, what the Quran tells us about itself, and material evidence, wax, tablets, palm sticks, Quran talismans on scapula and on papyri, entire Quranic surahs on papyri, and early parchment Quran codices. In the compilation of encyclopedic texts, I returned to the Roman world and, following in the footsteps of Monica Amsler, looked at how movable wooden slats might have enabled a text made up of a number of self-contained passages to coalesce into a longer piece. The palm leaf Quran in the Museum of Sharjah lets us visualize just how easy it is to imagine a Surah 2 divided up in this way. All in all, I'm very pleased with myself for positing such a neat, diachronic explanation for a structural phenomenon, but massive disclaimer here, this is my first excursion into material culture, and I may well be solving my jigsaw with mismatched pieces. I look forward to being set straight. Thank you.